It all started in an ancient castle lost in one of the old countries. King Vlad stood erect, keeping his head up despite the shouts and noise around him. The vampires pointed their fingers at him and rioted. One shouted, "Kill him!" They didn't want a king who bows his head to the people. Vlad realized that without power, the rebellion could not be stopped. Without wasting time, he activated blood magic. From the blood clots, he created a long blade. Yellow-purple rays flashed around it. He brought his blade down sharply and looked at the crowd with fury in his gaze. Standing on top of the castle, Vlad raised his sword and began to spin it in the air. A flash of lightning erupted from the blade, destroying all who went against it. Looking down from above, Vlad asked, "Did you really think that quantity could defeat me?" King Vlad said quietly that they were just stupid vampires. But no one would hear those words anymore. All who rebelled are dead. Looking at the pile of bodies, Vlad thought, no matter how much he taught them, it was no use. He knew it was advantageous for vampires and humans to live together. But the stupid vampires never realized it. Suddenly there were footsteps behind him. Vlad turned around and saw Adam. But Adam did not come in peace. His look spoke for itself. With one precise sword stroke, he pierced Vlad. Smirking, he asked, "You really don't understand why it ended like that?" Afterward, Adam quietly said goodbye to the great vampire king. He pulled the sword sharply from Vlad's body. Blood rushed out. Adam smiled broadly, savoring the moment. He watched with interest as Vlad slowly fell. There was no pity in his gaze, only contempt and hatred. "Until we meet again," Adam said. Vlad only had time to cast one last glance before he died. In the next second, Vlad's body flew downward with tremendous speed. With his death, everything changed. The world in which he had dreamed of an alliance with humans was gone. Now the vampires have the upper hand. The world was plunged into eternal darkness. After losing their king, the vampires began to openly hunt humans, turning them into food. The humans had no choice but to hide. But even in this chaos, humanity has not given up. A resistance organization has emerged, dreaming of bringing back freedom and light. As one of the vampires targeted Hibiki, his partner screamed and managed to warn him. In the next second, he jumped forward and stood between Hibiki and the enemy, displaying his sword as a shield. Hibiki looked away awkwardly and apologized quietly. He knew he was of little use in a fight against vampires. The dark-haired guy exhaled heavily and said that it was only getting worse. Others were dying while covering Hibiki. Hibiki exclaimed that he wanted to fight beside them, not just stand on the sidelines. But the guy just shook his head and replied, "You're in our way. It's best to just stay out of it." When he added that Hibiki shouldn't have been born at all, the man's insides shivered. Despite the conversation, the guy continued to hold his sword, trying to fend off the vampire's blow. But the forces were too unequal. The vampire tossed him aside in a single motion. He was quickly at his side and put the blade to his throat, preparing for the final blow. Suddenly, a warrior appeared out of nowhere. She was rushing with determination in her eyes. Without wasting a second, she sprang at the vampire, put her sword to his neck, and severed his head in one precise blow. Blood spurted in all directions. Hibiki stood in shock, looking at how easily she had dispensed with the vampire. And the girl herself didn't even blink, as if killing vampires was a regular thing for her. The dark-haired guy she had just saved couldn't believe his eyes. Gradually coming to his senses, he recognized her. It was Captain Maria. The blonde immediately walked over to Hibiki. She looked at him carefully and asked if everything was all right. Hibiki nodded and thanked her for her help. There were cheering voices all around. Everyone was discussing how cool Maria was and admiring her strength. The dark-haired boy couldn't understand why he suddenly felt such a powerful energy inside him. Someone in the crowd remarked that Captain Maria was not from here at all. Why all this resistance? But no sooner had he finished than the blade of Maria's sword pressed gently but surely against his lips. She stood beside him, looked at him with a cold stare, and threatened him with her sword. "Less talk on the battlefield," Captain Maria said calmly, not removing her weapon. Maria looked at him sternly and said that there was no place on the battlefield for those who liked to talk at the most important moment. Such people would die first. The boy was embarrassed and immediately mumbled an apology. Hibiki, watching Maria, suddenly felt a rush of inspiration. He realized that he was not just a warrior, but a really strong man. Suddenly, Captain Maria shifted her gaze directly to Hibiki. She pronounced his name clearly and called him an unofficial member of the 7th Division. Hibiki blushed, but immediately straightened up and focused, listening intently to her every word. Maria told him to stay in the rear and support the squad from behind, but Hibiki objected sharply. He said he didn't want to just stand there. He wanted to protect everyone too. He looked at the captain with determination and asked her for permission to fight equally with everyone else. In response, Maria held out her hand to him. A soft, warm smile lit up her face. She said that the desire to protect others is a great strength. Captain Maria added confidently, "You can become strong too, Hibiki." Then, smiling kindly, she asked him to do his best for the victory of their division. Hibiki blushed heavily as he looked at the captain. He hesitated for a moment, but then nodded firmly, promising that he would do his best. Under the command of Captain Maria, the men began to prepare for battle. Hibiki looked at her with admiration and thought that one day he too would be that strong. Thanks to Maria, everyone felt more confident. She not only trained, but also raised morale. Humans have taken the first step in regaining their freedom and banishing the vampires. In each of them lived the hope for a bright future where humanity could live without fear. But when the attack began, Hibiki seemed to freeze. A wave of terror swept over him. The bodies of his companions lay before him. Those who had recently dreamed of saving the world were now dead. Among the dead, he noticed a girl with long blonde hair. Hibiki was breathing heavily, unable to look away. He was in shock, as if the whole world had collapsed right before his eyes. Hibiki just couldn't believe what was happening. Everything seemed like a nightmare. Why? Why did this happen? The thoughts swirled around in his head, giving him no rest. Seeing a vampire with a severed human head in his hand, he realized these were special class vampires, and they weren't ready for them. At one point, Hibiki screamed at the top of his voice. Tears started streaming down his face. Lord Frist first asked why Daniel was taking so long, but when he saw him fighting, he only grinned disappointedly. Daniel regretfully replied that he had failed his expectations. Hibiki looked at the advancing army of vampires and realized he couldn't retreat. He must fight. Clenching his fists, he reached for the sword that lay nearby. But as he crawled on the ground, he hit a rock and made an unnecessary noise. The vampires heard it and turned around in surprise. Hearing footsteps behind him, Hibiki turned around in horror, heart racing. Lord Frist activated blood magic. Scarlet drops gathered in the air, forming a perfectly shaped sword. Hibiki watched in horror as the blood turned into a weapon. He cried out, feeling fear gripping his entire body. A real sharp sword emerged from the scarlet clot. Lord Frist raised it above Hibiki and asked coldly, "Why don't you join your friends?" Hibiki couldn't help it. The sobs burst out on their own. He just didn't know what to do. Lord Frist took a swing, but at the same moment, Captain Maria stepped between him and Hibiki, blocking the blow with her sword. Hibiki cringed. He hadn't expected to see her here, and Frist suddenly recognized the girl. He squinted. "You're one of the hunters, right?" Maria struggled to hold her sword. Her strength was running out, but she continued to stand between the enemy and Hibiki. With one blow, Lord Frist knocked her sword away and tossed it aside. He grinned. Now I see why Daniel was in trouble. When Maria was left unarmed, he grabbed her hair sharply and said he could see. She was at her limit. Lord Frist grinned and looked at Captain Maria with a maddening fire in his eyes. "You can barely stand on your feet, but you still defend him? Humans are so inscrutable," he said with a sneer. The next moment, Lord Frist pressed down hard on Maria's head, and blood flowed out of her face. "A monster with an empty heart will never understand a human," Maria replied with a smile. When she heard that, Lord Frist gave her a look of madness. A moment later, Captain Maria, deprived of her strength, fell to the ground. Lord Frist examined her and told his subordinates that he had lost all interest in her. "Do what you want with her," he ordered. The vampires approached from different directions, grabbed Maria by the arms and pressed their swords against her knees so she couldn't move. Hibiki, trembling with fear, called out loudly to the girl. He wanted to run up to her, but his legs wouldn't obey him. One of the vampires raised his sword over Captain Maria, preparing to deliver the final blow. Hibiki was in a panic. His heart was beating with such force that it seemed like it was about to burst out of his chest. In his last breath, he shouted out, "Captain Maria!" At that moment, the vampire lowered his sword and swung it across Maria's shoulder, cutting her arm off. Blood gushed from the wound, flooding the ground around her. Captain Maria cried out in pain. Hibiki shrieked, following, unable to look at what was happening. One vampire was still holding Maria, and the other was holding her severed arm. Hearing Hibiki scream, one of the vampires turned around sharply. He stepped closer, showing Maria's severed hand right in front of Hibiki's face. The boy almost threw up. Getting very close, the vampire squeezed blood from his hand right onto Hibiki's face, drenching it with his own partner's blood. "Drink!" the vampire demanded. Hibiki was shocked at the cruelty. The vampire squeezed the bloody hand even tighter, as if enjoying what was happening. He looked at Hibiki and said, "If you drink the blood, we'll let you live." His gaze grew even crazier. "Just drink it, like we do," he hissed, reaching his hand closer. At that moment, Hibiki realized that everything happened because he was weak. If he had been stronger, he would have been able to protect someone. Realizing that Maria might die, Hibiki cried and opened his mouth, about to drink blood. The vampire looked at him, sighed heavily, and said the guy had no conviction at all. "That's what I hate most about people," he added with disgust. He called Hibiki so weak it was just disgusting to look at. Without hesitation, the vampire plunged his sharp sword into Hibiki's chest. Blood gushed out, flooding the floor. Looking at the dying boy, the vampire grinned and hissed, "Pathetic." Hibiki, dying, reached his hand out to Maria. She was protecting him, and he couldn't even try to save her. If I was stronger, everyone might have survived, he thought, losing consciousness. He was dying with the thought that he had failed those who believed in him. It was his last pain. Hibiki's heart stopped. But the desire to become strong and protect the people he cared about didn't disappear. After his death, he found himself in a dark world. King Vlad himself stood before him. Noticing the potential in Hibiki, Vlad decided to use the boy to return to the human world. He drew a magic circle and told Hibiki to put his hands inside the pattern. As soon as Hibiki touched the circle, Vlad released his power and began to transmigrate into his body. In the next second, Hibiki resurrected right in front of the shocked vampires. Even Captain Maria couldn't believe her eyes. The boy was alive again. Hibiki sharply struck one of the vampires. He flew backward and dropped his sword. Grinning, Hibiki uttered, "And this body feels even better than before." All the vampires looked at him in utter shock. No one understood how he'd even survived. Vlad in Hibiki's body covered his face with his palm, concentrated and activated blood magic. A bloody sword quickly formed in his hand. Violet and yellow sparks flashed around the blade, pure vampire energy. All the vampires watched in shock as Hibiki easily controlled a power beyond their comprehension. One of the older vampires grabbed his sword. He admitted, "I thought he was dead. I guess I was wrong." Vlad only swung his sword, and a wall of lightning flew from the blade, growing with each passing moment. A moment later, several vampires were defeated. Hibiki stepped forward to the remaining ones. He swung his sword downward sharply. The blade glistened, dripping with the blood of those who hadn't dodged. Grinning, Vlad in Hibiki's body ordered, "Kneel, bow before your king." His voice sounded ominous. "Your king has returned," he said calmly, looking at the vampires with coldness in his gaze. The others froze with fear. It seemed to them that everything that was happening was just a delusion and a nightmare. Hibiki jumped up to one of the vampires and sliced its jaw in half, then sighed tiredly. "You're so stupid." He cast a threatening glance at the others. "It's been so long, and you've already forgotten your king." Without giving them a second thought, Hibiki found himself next to one of the vampires and put his blade to his temple. In the next instant, he soared into the air and plunged his sword straight into his enemy's head. Covering his face from the bloody fountain, he asked, "Don't you even remember your master?" Then he lifted his foot and pressed the dead vampire's head to the floor with force. Jumping up, Hibiki did several swift kicks and somersaults, leaving his enemies choking in their own blood. Exhaling heavily, he whispered, "No, the fight isn't over yet." He slammed his sword through the air, creating a magical wave flying towards the remaining vampires. The wave swept sharply across the hall, leaving bloody cuts on the vampires' faces. Hibiki swung his sword again, and the vampires screamed in panic as they scattered. One of them, pointing down the path, yelled, "Run! Hurry!" Hibiki followed leisurely and said that betrayal always comes with a price. The vampires were in shock. They couldn't understand how Vlad was even here if he had died long ago. Suddenly, a single voice called out to Daniel. He could barely stand on his feet. Moving closer, Vlad asked Daniel how things had been going for him the last few days. Daniel turned around and struggled to shout out, "How are you even alive? You're dead!" But Vlad just laughed in response, loud and creepy. Picking up the bloody sword, he looked at Daniel with crazed eyes. "You remember me, don't you?" And in the next instant, he thrust his sword straight into his enemy's forehead. Vlad grabbed Daniel's head and began to slowly press the sword deeper and deeper into his forehead. He demanded, "Tell the afterlife that King Vlad has returned." With a final effort, Vlad thrust the blade in so hard that Daniel died instantly. Exhaling heavily, Vlad looked around, surveying the battlefield. Commander Maria looked at Hibiki in shock. She didn't understand how he had even survived and become so strong. Hibiki staggered, struggling to stay on his feet. His strength was wearing thin. He looked sharply at Captain Maria. There was something strange in his gaze. He began to slowly approach her, as if he wanted to say something. But not calculating his strength, Hibiki suddenly collapsed to the ground. He fell right beside Maria. The girl cried out in fear, "Hibiki!" But no matter how much she screamed, Hibiki didn't regain consciousness. Hibiki's consciousness was drowned in pain. He struggled to open his eyes, not realizing what was happening. He couldn't tell if he was alive or already dead. In front of him sat a man on a throne. His long black cloak was flowing down and his hair was falling off his shoulders. He just sat there and smiled. Hibiki stared at him confused, not recognizing him. Vlad confirmed that he was the Vampire King. He greeted Hibiki and said, "Welcome to postmortem, Hibiki." The boy stood there, not believing his eyes. He didn't understand why the Vampire King was here, and when this nightmare would end. Vlad explained that they were in his dying mind, and that he himself was also dead. 500 years ago, he was betrayed and killed by those he considered brothers. Hibiki couldn't believe it. 500 years ago, when vampires ruled the world, Vlad said that after refusing to coexist with humans, the vampires killed him and plunged the world into darkness. His soul wandered for centuries, thinking only of revenge. But everything changed when a man who drank the blood of another man appeared. Vlad looked at Hibiki with a slight smile. It was then that he was able to awaken. The woman's blood opened his way back. Hibiki recoiled in shock. Vlad calmly added that he had killed all the vampires in that battle. He snapped his fingers, and an illusion appeared in front of Hibiki. Hibiki saw a memory. Mountains of corpses torn apart by his own hands. Vlad said that the power in Hibiki's body wouldn't last long. He has a body but no strength. Vlad has strength and soul but no body. Holding out a hand with long claws, Vlad offered to team up. He promised that he would then resurrect Hibiki. His eyes lit up with a scarlet light. Hibiki didn't understand. Would he really have to team up with a vampire? The one he had hated all his life? Vlad calmly replied that the hatred would mean nothing if he died. It would simply disappear. He said that Hibiki would either die a useless death or survive and gain power. "So what will you choose?" he asked confidently. Hibiki remembered his father, his mother, his sister, the ones he wanted to protect the most. If he gets stronger, he can do it. He can keep the past from happening again. Vlad held out his hand again. His face was adorned with a calm, confident smile. Hibiki could no longer distinguish between his thoughts and those of others. But he realized that even if he had to become a monster, he would do it. Moonlight illuminated his face. He had made a choice. Upon waking up, Hibiki was startled to see Captain Maria holding his body in her arms. Coughing, he struggled to raise his head and addressed her quietly. Maria looked at his body and said excitedly that she was worried about him. Hibiki started to apologize, smelling the smell of burning in the air. As he looked around, he realized that everything around them was on fire. He stood up, realizing the city was on fire. "We have to go save the people." But Maria stopped him, explaining that the whole battle was just a distraction. The vampires found their hiding place. While some fought, others set the city on fire. Hibiki stared helplessly at the puffs of black smoke. But the captain added even more dire words. Of all those in the battle and in the city, only the two of them had survived. Hibiki tore forward, dreadfully hoping to find at least one of his family. But where his home used to be, he saw only the bodies of his parents. The boy couldn't hold back his tears. He fell on his knees and screamed with grief. His dead parents lay under the rubble of the house, and he himself sat on his knees, crying like a child, unable to stop. One of the vampires heard his sobs and muttered that humans were too noisy. He was sure everyone was already dead. Clutching his blade, the vampire moved toward Hibiki, intending to finish him off. But suddenly Maria jumped out in front of him. She closed in on Hibiki with her sword and yelled for him to run as he continued to sit there, unmoving from shock. Vampires started flying in from all directions. Hibiki couldn't understand where they were coming from. Captain Maria stood in front of him like a human shield, not allowing the enemies to pass. One of the vampires lunged forward and knocked her arm away, blood splattering on the ground. She barely had time to bounce back. It was getting harder to fight with her wounded arm, but she didn't give up. Hibiki screamed, not knowing what to do. He felt useless, but he couldn't just watch. Remembering his pact with the vampire and the power he'd gained, he clenched his fists. It was time to fight too. With trembling fingers, Hibiki gripped his blade. He was afraid, but fear could no longer stop him. Screaming with all his might, he lunged forward, aiming straight for the vampire. But the enemy didn't even move. A powerful kick to the chest threw Hibiki back. The boy collapsed to the ground, dropping his sword. A painful wheeze escaped from his chest. Maria immediately turned to him, checking to see if he was alive. The vampire snorted and said he didn't understand what a pathetic creature he was. He was about to decide who to finish off first, but suddenly a thin red line appeared on his neck. Before he realized what had happened, his head separated from his body and blood rushed from his artery. Maria recoiled back, not realizing what had just happened. Hibiki stood up, looking at the corpse. The vampire was finished off by a human. He was from the anti-vampire unit. A precise, fatal blow. In front of them stood a group of fighters in blue and white uniforms, weapons drawn. Calm, confident, as if they knew they had everything under control. One of the hunters looked around the ruins and said quietly that the city had already burned. He looked at Hibiki and Maria and calmly added that they would deal with the remaining vampires. Hibiki froze. He didn't even believe that the vampire hunter squad really existed. They weren't just fighters. They were the elite. While the resistance fights as best they can, the hunters confront the vampire leaders themselves. Meanwhile, new waves of night creatures were approaching them from all sides. A guy with long dark hair braided into braids grinned. It was Vice Captain Toto from the 7th Squad, A-Class. He said that it was hard to think of a more disgusting way. A blonde-haired guy with icy eyes named Sato, B-grade, shrugged his shoulders. Nothing new, Maul. The pink-haired Mishiyuki, also B-grade, snorted, adding that vampires and don't deserve to live. The hunters clutched the handles of their weapons almost simultaneously and rushed into battle with a shout. A huge wave of monsters came crashing down directly on Toto. Toto slid his hand across the blade, and bright lightning immediately ran across it. He stood and grinned, asking the vampires if they were ready to die. Without waiting for an answer, he rushed forward, smashing the monsters with lightning-fast blows. The vampires began to scatter in panic, but he continued to slice them without stopping. But suddenly the blond man was ahead of him. In one motion, he cut several necks at once. Sato, crouched down beside him, calmly said that Toto was acting too carelessly again. At that moment, there was an indignant shout. "You've ruined my uniform!" Mishiyuki glanced furiously at her dress, already stained with blood. Swearing, she twisted the Morgenstern with force and smashed the head of another vampire. Hibiki and Maria stood to the side, watching in shock as the hunters weeded out the hordes of monsters with ease, as if it was just a training session. The brats began to shout as they recognized the hunters and intended to retreat. Hibiki said that the hunter squad is truly incredible. The pink-haired girl turned to them and told them that the vampires were finished and wondered if they were okay. Noticing that Maria had lost her arm, she yelled that something had to be done about it. Suddenly everyone was looking closely at this blonde and recognized her. They asked why Maria was here. The girl faded her gaze and stared at the ground, and Hibiki asked what it all meant. Tato started to explain that maybe the guy didn't know about her because he was in the resistance, and Maria was an amazing hunter. The girl rendered first aid to Maria, bandaging her arm with a bandage. They were told that Maria was dead and missing. Maria replied that it was a long time ago and she couldn't protect anyone now. Their conversation was interrupted by a thud, which sent the blonde flying off to the side. Sato crawled on the ground, scarred and dirty, whispering that he had failed everyone when he should have been standing guard. Blood flowed from his mouth as the vampire's heavy boot pressed his face into the ground. The highborn vampire exuded a grim aura, angry at being distracted, and said that these maggots were getting too bold. The vice-captain stepped forward, sword out, preparing to fight to the last man. Vampires were approaching them from all sides, and at the head was a leader with a scarlet stone on his chest and a predatory grin. Mishiyuki unwrapped the chain, tensed and said Jinguji wasn't here, and asked what to do. Sato struggled to raise his head and said they had no choice. They'd have to fight. The hunters snapped out of their seats and rushed into the fray, crashing into the ranks of the night creatures. Hibiki stood to the side, dazed. His eyes were filled with fear, despair, and anger. Hearing the screams and smelling the blood, he whispered that he had to get stronger and reached for his sword with a shudder. Hibiki felt a lot of pain, and Maria looked at him and said it was stupid to get into a fight when his body couldn't even move like that. He wondered what he should do. The vampire's words replayed in his head. If he wants power, he has one condition to fulfill. But Hibiki didn't understand what that condition was. The vampire said he'd forgotten to mention it earlier, but it was simple. He leaned over and added in a whisper, "The condition of strength is to drink Maria's blood again." Hibiki's eyes widened in horror when he realized he was being asked to fulfill such a condition. The scraping of metal ripped the air. Human and vampire clashed in a fierce battle. Hibiki flashed his eyes with disdain and asked the brunette if that was all he was capable of. Sato tensed up and, with an effort to hold back the blow, tried to deflect the sword flying at him. The boys saw Toto struggling to hold back the onslaught of his enemies. The fight had gone on too long, and his strength was fading. There were too many enemies surrounding them. Smaller vampires that couldn't be counted. Sato realized they had to fight their way through the crowd. Mishiyuki cried out, missing the blow. Furious, she raised her weapon and repelled the attack again. Wiping the blood from her face, she shouted to her partner that they were just trying to survive this fight, not break through somewhere. Hibiki, clenching his teeth, cried out. He couldn't believe that he would have to drink human blood again. But no one said he had to kill the girl. He just needed to use her blood as a catalyst to restore his powers. After thinking about it for a moment, Hibiki said loudly that this was not a solution. People don't do that, and this plan wouldn't save them. Vlad, hearing this, decided to take matters into his own hands. Before he could realize what was happening, Hibiki's consciousness went blank. Maria noticed his strange behavior and immediately rushed to him. Hibiki grabbed her, glaring at her with a cold stare. He approached, and with coldness in his voice, asked her to drink her blood. Maria's eyes widened with shock. It's exactly the same in Hibiki's subconscious. But he didn't stop. He kept pushing. He needed power, and he was willing to do anything for it. His eyes flashed scarlet. As he came closer and closer to the girl, he ignored Hibiki's inner cries and reached for her neck with his lips. Suddenly his hand was grabbed. Hibiki stopped him by forcefully pushing him away and regaining control of his body. Vlad hummed, admiring the boy's willpower. He realized it wouldn't be so easy to pull him back in. Hibiki squeezed his wrist, feeling the strength needed to protect people. Hurting them was definitely not something he wanted to do. Vlad's scarlet eyes squinted. He didn't quite understand what was going on, but the human will intrigued him. How strong was she? It looked quite interesting. With a hum, Vlad gave control of his body to the guy, asking him to show him something really exciting. Hibiki regained control of himself and immediately tried to apologize to Maria, but he didn't have time to finish. The girl interrupted him, calmly agreeing to give him her blood. Hibiki was confused and, not knowing what to say, met her gaze. If her blood really does give him his power back, maybe he has a chance to save everyone. Maybe they can survive this crisis. But the guy couldn't face it. He still hoped there was a way to stop her bleeding. Without listening to him, Maria removed the soaked bandage. The blood rushed with renewed vigor. Reaching out a hand covered in blood, she brought it up to the pale Hibiki. There was terror in her eyes, but she continued calmly. Her hand touched his lips and blood ran down them, pooling inside. Maria met his gaze with confidence and said quietly, "Come on, fight." Swallowing the warm blood that was spreading down his throat, Hibiki felt the world around him blur. A vortex of fire swirled in the air, shimmering with bright colors, surrounding Hibiki. The vampires were pushing them back harder and harder. Toto was already losing ground, but there was no one to help him. If they were distracted, death awaited them. Suddenly, a voice called out to the brunette, as if from heaven. Everyone flinched in surprise. All eyes of the crowd went to the sky. Swinging his sword, Hibiki rushed into the thick of the enemies. Scarlet eyes sparkled and the boy frowned, setting himself up for a fight. Without blinking an eye, in the blink of an eye, he cut through the crowd of vampires in his path. Toto didn't realize what was happening. He only stared shocked at the guy who had landed next to him. Hibiki didn't pay attention to his gaze. He thought to himself about how light his body had become. He felt almost no pain, and his physical strength was on a whole other level. It was Vlad's strength. The vampire took a step forward, glaring at the boy. He didn't understand how a man could have such power, much less pull out that sword. Hibiki cast a glance at the approaching vampire. Suddenly, Hibiki's voice sounded in the vampire's head. The words about just killing him flashed through his mind, finally shocking the fanged assassin. A panicked thought flashed through his mind. The guy had just entered his mind. The sword sliced through the air, heading straight for the vampire, but he managed to deflect the blow at the last moment before he realized what was happening. Out of panic, the vampire ordered his subordinates to attack at once, but before he could move them, their throats were slit. Before he could finalize his plan, the vampire only watched as his soldiers fell dead. Hibiki pointed the blade straight at the vampire and said, "Show me your sword, Frist." His words were spoken with a special predatory glint in his eyes. If he didn't listen, death was inevitable. How did this man know his name? What's going on? Frist was confused. A sword appeared in the vampire's hands, flickering with scarlet light. Why was the man across the room smelling Vlad's scent? He should be dead. With a shout, Frist rushed to the attack. The guy easily deflected the blow and looked coldly into the vampire's eyes. Frist bared his teeth and bounced back, but it didn't help. In the next second, Hibiki was beside him again. Grabbing his blade, he stabbed the vampire's chest with an indifferent expression. "It's too dangerous!" Frist shouted, vanishing into thin air. Rising into the air, he laughed caustically, pointing towards Hibiki despite the blade sticking out of his chest. Frist was sure that such powers were too much for humans. He glanced away and was about to leave, but he didn't have time. Suddenly a second blade pierced through his mouth. A wheezing sound erupted from his throat, echoing throughout the neighborhood. Hibiki squinted his eyes and said with an icy tone that no one said anything about him having only one weapon. Flames engulfed the vampire's body and blood spatters erupted in the air. Hibiki was about to leave, but after looking over the corpse he cast a piercing glance at it and snatched up his blade. Looking at the weapon, he realized that it handled a very powerful vampire without difficulty. Clutching the hilt in his hands, the guy thought that with the power of a vampire king, he could protect everyone. Suddenly, a familiar voice sounded behind him. He turned around happily, recognizing the voice of one of his friends. All four of them looked at him warily. A squad of hunters watched Hibiki anxiously, his powers resembling those of vampires. Hibiki cast a surprised look at his friends, sensing that they might start acting aggressive. He asked them to stop before attacking and suggested they discuss things calmly. But Sato admonished everyone to be careful, saying that who knows, maybe Hibiki is a vampire just trying to gain trust. Hibiki felt the tension stronger. He was afraid that they would find out about his power granted by Vlad, even though he remained human. Sato gripped the hilt of his blade tightly and wondered if he had killed everyone in the resistance. Hibiki stammered awkwardly, replying that he wasn't. Sato shouted loudly and asked Vice Captain Todo for permission to attack. Todo asked him to take his time, for it wasn't clear yet what Hibiki's intentions were. But as always, there was a definite but. Todo took the hint and put his sword up to Hibiki's neck. He said he can't let Hibiki out of his sight because no one knows what he might do at any moment. Since they met Hibiki along with Captain Maria, they decided to take control of her as well. Meanwhile, the vampires had gathered for a meeting. Count Frist was dead, and they had to decide what to do next. One of the vampires doubted that Frist's death and his title mattered to them at all. The brunette replied that rank did not matter, for Count Frist was far more useful than his interlocutor. But as soon as those words escaped his lips, his head flew off his body, and a fountain of blood gushed from the wound. The vampire pulled himself up and apologized to the brunette, forgetting to accidentally rip his head off with his vampire powers. He smiled madly and added, his hand twitching because the brunette had said something completely unintelligent. At this point, the vampire was admonished that he should stop losing his temper. The vampire whose head had been cut off laughed harshly and shouted that all other vampires were lowly cowards who were afraid of humans. He added that it was absurd that such low creatures as humans dared to stand up to vampires. The vampire, moving his fingers, said that they should show people what true desperation was. Meanwhile, Hibiki was bound tightly, and his head was covered with a sack. After a long journey, the group finally arrived at the right place, and there they removed the sack from his head. Todo apologized to Hibiki for the rough treatment, explaining that it was a forced measure. They didn't want anyone to know about this place. Todo calmly explained that they were hunters. They don't fight vampires just any way but with special methods. He held out his hand to Hibiki and added, "There's an organization that trains people like them. It gives orders and guides the fighters. It's the Hunters Guild." Hibiki froze, looking at Todo. He nodded, inviting him to come closer. At that moment, a man approached them. He praised Todo for a job well done. It was the captain of the 7th Squad, Jinguji. He grinned and said that he had just returned, but he wouldn't be going to the fight. He immediately asked what about the damage, if there were any casualties. Then he added, "What else happened?" Todo silently pointed at Hibiki. At that moment, Captain Maria looked away. A sadness flashed across her face. Todo looked at Hibiki and said he was one of the survivors. But he added, there was something about him that made him suspicious. That's why he decided to keep an eye on him. Jinguji said a polite hello to Hibiki and introduced himself. "Commander of Team 7, Jinguji." Then he nodded toward Todo and said, "And this is our vice president, Todo." Jinguji explained that those who brought Hibiki were hunters from the vampire fighting squads. There are 7 teams in total, from S to 7th. The strongest are the S class. Hibiki flinched upon hearing that. He hadn't expected to find himself in such a serious organization. After a moment, Jinguji turned to him and Maria. He apologized. They couldn't save their team. Hibiki, stammering, tried to reply, "It's not your fault. You have nothing to apologize for." After a couple minutes, Sato put his foot on Hibiki's back. He was on all fours, breathing heavily. Sato frowned. "Enough about the past. It can't be changed anymore. What's important now is to determine your rank." At this time, Captain Maria climbed up to the measuring circle, a special device that showed the level of ability. Everyone froze. The circle glowed, beginning to scan Maria. No one said a word. Michiyuki took a step forward. Well, as expected of Captain Maria, she really is strong. A moment later, the circle yielded results. Maria's abilities were simply incredible. This magic circle is usually used to determine a hunter's class. Todo was surprised. Even without one arm, Maria was confidently A-class. Maria had always been known as a strong hunter. Even among veterans, she had a high reputation. But then, why did it go so badly if she was in place? That question was still unanswered. When she left the measuring circle, Maria awkwardly fixed her hair. She looked away, as if avoiding the gaze. When someone started talking about Zilla, an A-class, she was surprised. She apologized, saying she had never heard those words before. The blonde explained, "People with a predisposition to hunt can use special abilities. A-class and above get access to even stronger techniques." He added, "The power for these techniques is the Zyle. The more Zyle, the more powerful the abilities and the longer you can fight." Michiyuki said, "Todo lost because he didn't use Zyle." Todo only grinned at that, a little embarrassed. Jinguji concentrated his strength in his palm. Zyle is just an indicator of level. The highest is S-class, Hibiki thought excitedly. "But it's not like I haven't seen Captain Maria use the force at all." Sato roughly shoved Hibiki in the back. "You're next," he barked. Hibiki hesitantly approached the magic circle and stood in the very center, feeling the intense stares. At the same second, the circle lit up. It began to scan Hibiki's abilities. Sato shouted, "What are you hiding there? Show me what you can do, vampire!" He bluntly stated that he wanted to rip off Hibiki's mask and show everyone his true self. It was going smoothly at first, but suddenly the circle began to release painful pulses. Hibiki could barely stand on his feet. Sparks swirled around him, as if the magic was trying to contain something too strong. The boys were frightened and asked Jinguji what was happening. Todo shouted, "That can mean one thing. There is incredible power hidden in him." A few minutes passed, and the sparks began to fade away. Hibiki remained standing in the center of the circle, breathing heavily. He looked at his hands and asked quietly, "What was that?" Fear and confusion were audible in his voice. Todo walked over to Hibiki and patted his shoulder, telling him that sometimes you can't accurately measure strength if it's too weak. Sato continued to insist that the magic circle reacted this way because of the vampire's latent powers. Todo couldn't stand it and asked Sato to shut up, not to keep repeating about it all the time. Hibiki clenched his fist, frustrated. He didn't understand how he could be too weak when he had Vlad's strength. Jinguji noticed that Hibiki looked dejected and said that he should be grateful that he had survived. The rest didn't matter anymore. He smiled and added that sometimes people suddenly realize their powers as hunters. The main thing is to survive until then. Hibiki agreed with the commander, but the feeling of sadness never left him. That night, Hibiki lay in bed for a long time thinking about what had happened. The thoughts kept him awake. He was frustrated that he could not protect his family and the common townspeople. Suddenly, the thought of a squad of vampire hunters crossed his mind. He realized he had to live to protect them. The boy covered his face with his hand, hoping to get some sleep and take his mind off everything. But Vlad's image immediately flashed before my eyes, the very moment when he'd offered the deal. Suddenly, Hibiki flinched. There was a voice somewhere nearby, a loud, anxious voice. "All squads urgently assemble in position," came from inside the room. "Attention! The base has been attacked by a group of vampires." The blows of the blade sent scarlet splashes flying apart, flooding the ground around them. Sato didn't understand why the enemy was attacking now. Did they know there were few hunters? Wounding 3 more, he thought. A traitor could have been among them. Todo shouted for Sato and Mishiyuki to restrain their enemies. In the blue sector, the 7th squad was holding out. There was no commander in the ash sector. The deputy captain rushed there, remembering. The red area was in a civilian zone. The barrier held, but the situation was dangerous. Jinguji had also disappeared somewhere. Hibiki shook the door, hoping to get in and help the others in the fight. He froze. He could feel someone's presence behind him. Vlad stood with a smirk. He asked if the guy wanted his help. Turning around abruptly, Hibiki said that he was no longer going to drink Captain Maria's blood. He added at the end, so that he would no longer be underestimated. Everything went dark, and in a moment he was back in reality. The hand lifted on its own, shocking the boy. There was a flash of light, and the door shattered. The shards rumbled down the corridor. Hibiki stared at his palm in utter shock, not realizing how this had happened. Vlad's voice echoed in my head. He'd said that blood didn't have to be drunk. Even a low-ranking vampire could unlock power. The boy clenched his fist. There was a strange feeling in his chest, something between hope and excitement. He thought maybe this was just the thing, a chance to fight his own way, without other people's blood. With a look of determination, he turned to the vampire and asked if they could fight without it. After reaching the ash sector, Hibiki jumped down and began chopping enemies with his blade with lightning speed. Covering the wounded, he quickly asked if they were all right. One of the fighters was lying in a pool of blood. Hibiki crouched down next to him and quickly examined the wounded. There was a lot of blood, but the wound was shallow. The girl noticed the blood on his face, but he waved it away. It wasn't time to worry. The vampires surrounded them, squeezing the ring tighter and tighter. Despite the dozens defeated, there were still too many enemies. Hibiki pressed his hand against the wound. His breathing was labored. He realized that even if he could fight, he didn't have much time. Fiery reflections flashed in the sky, casting the darkness in a bright light. Suddenly, lightning flashed and struck beside him, knocking the ground and scaring the hell out of him. Hibiki turned around sharply at the sound, not immediately realizing what had happened. In the center of the sparks stood a man. He recognized him. It was Jinguji-san. Hibiki called out to him, still in shock. Jinguji turned around with a slight smile and greeted the guy. He had come to say something important. Ignoring the chaos, he effortlessly hurled a lightning bolt at the approaching vampires. His face remained calm. The impact was precise. The vampires froze in sparks, not fully realizing what had just happened. Hibiki didn't understand what had just happened. Did the blows not work? Or had he just dodged? The options flashed frantically in his head. Jinguji interrupted his thoughts and asked if he had seen Todo and the rest of the squad. Then he realized. Hibiki was in prison. He couldn't know. But there was no time to think. The vampires were attacking again. The captain exhaled heavily, watching the enemies climb again as if the lightning hadn't happened. He raised his sword, surrounded by sparks. Finally, he turned his attention to the pesky opponents. With an icy stare, he said not to interfere with his conversation with the guy. Sparks flashed around him again, and immediately snapped into the sky, turning into powerful lightning bolts. The discharge slammed into all the vampires at once, leaving them no chance. Hibiki covered his eyes with his hand from the bright flash, barely staying on his feet. Looking at Jinguji, he realized there was definitely an S-class level fighter in front of him. People with gifts are those who have been given strength by heaven. Their faith makes them stronger. Their abilities are called extraordinary. Jinguji is one of them. His strength is lightning. He's S-class, no doubt about it. The impact missed Hibiki and the others, but the vampires were all blown away at once. One by one they fell, leaving only smoke behind. Hibiki shuddered. It was the first time he had ever seen such a difference in power level. It was truly overwhelming. He was pulled out of his stupor by Jinguji's voice. The boy flinched, straightening as if on cue. The same question confused him again as to whether he had seen the team. Jinguji folded his arms across his chest and calmly said that he seemed to be lost. They were interrupted by a voice from behind them. Toto was rushing toward them at full speed. Without wasting a second, he reported the situation. Sato and the others held lines in the blue and ash areas, but there were no hunters in the red area. But they couldn't help them yet. More vampires were already approaching behind Toto's back. They didn't give a second's respite. Hibiki jumped up sharply at Jinguji, hoping he could do something to help. Jinguji examined the boy and noticed how quickly the wound in his side had healed. He held his gaze a little longer, noticing it. After a brief pause, the captain reached into his suit pocket. He took out his hand and placed it on Hibiki's shoulder. Calmly, he asked if he could trust him with the red neighborhood. This dumbfounded both the boy and Toto. In his hand was a small blue ball like a talisman. He handed it to Hibiki. A man found the item after a battle with vampires and felt it might be useful to the lad. Vlad, lurking in the shadows of subconsciousness, shuddered. With a smile, he said that Hibiki should take the balloon. Hibiki stood there confused and didn't know what to say. But suddenly Toto shrieked. Toto was worried. Sending Hibiki alone to the red neighborhood was like sending him to his death. Besides, the guy was supposed to be in jail. The man, as if not listening to the objections, turned around and asked if Hibiki could handle it. Without hesitation, determined, Hibiki quickly agreed. He abruptly turned and ran, not giving Toto a chance to stop him. At this time in the Red District, vampires were wreaking havoc. The red-haired man, surrounded by dark energy, effortlessly broke the protective barrier. The crowd raved and praised him. Only Lord Damien could handle the defense so easily. Inferior vampires were already preying on civilians. The barrier took away people's abilities, and blood was easy to get. Damien took one look at the crowd and only hummed as he observed their ignorance. He glanced again at the orb in his hand, a red object exuding power. It was an ark, a vessel for the soul of a high-ranking vampire. If you fill the vessel with human blood, Damien will receive a reward from Lord Lawrence. Suddenly his attention was drawn away by a sharp knock nearby. Damien shifted his gaze from the sphere to the source of the sound and saw the girl. He wondered who she was. Marcus Damien's army suddenly attacked the hunter's base. It looked again like an unauthorized move by his subordinates. At this time, the vampires were sitting around a long table discussing the way forward. One brunette smiled and told his king not to worry, he had a clear plan. However, what struck everyone was the strength of Commander Maria. The vampires thought only civilians were here. The plan was a quick hit and run. Maria calmly said that she expected this from her prosthetic arm. She doesn't feel any discomfort at all. Stepping closer, she sliced one of the vampires vertically in half in an instant. Seeing this, the others shouted, "She's definitely an A-class hunter!" The red-haired vampire immediately lunged at her, but Maria raised her sword and fended off the blow, after which she immediately bounced away. She felt that she shouldn't go near him. Damien muttered irritably that he thought there were no hunters here. But he was wrong. Sato watched the fight and remembered the ranks among the vampires: Baron, Earl, Marquis, and next, Duke. And by Damien's fighting style, it's clear. He's definitely no lower than Marquis. Meanwhile, Damien ordered his own, "Cut off her head. Whatever she is, she can't survive without her head." Upon receiving the order, the vampires rushed towards Maria, blades drawn. Maria looked around. Since there were no civilians or hunters here, she could use the power she'd always kept hidden. Blood clots began to swirl around her and her body began to change. After a couple seconds, her hair turned white and the whites of her eyes turned black. The vampires, upon seeing this transformation, froze in utter shock. She stood right in front of the crowd. Most of them even had their mouths open in surprise. Without wasting a second, Maria sprang forward and with a powerful swing stabbed several of them in the throat. The others didn't even have time to move. Raising her sword, she said, "If you get in my way, I won't regret it." Only then did it dawn on everyone. She was a vampire too. Maria used the blood of defeated enemies, creating scarlet rhombuses from it that hovered in the air. Pointing her sword forward, she released bloody rays. There were too many to dodge. The bloody rays slammed straight into the vampires' faces with force. After a couple seconds, their heads began to melt as if from acid. Maria calmly explained, "The blood of an awakened hunter acts like silver, poisonous to vampires." She added that when you turn a vampire to ash, its soul disappears. And that's a lot scarier than just dying. Damien went numb. He couldn't even move, just stared at her in utter shock. He muttered quietly, "Is that the power of the Eye of Medusa?" Then he shouted, demanding an explanation as to how she even dared to use a power that was only available to vampires of the higher clans. But Maria didn't answer. Her silence angered Damien even more. Raising his heavy sword, he shouted, "Die!" But Maria was already in front of him and brought her long claws right up to his face. Damien couldn't move. Maria's strength bound his body, and the speed of her movements was inexplicable to him. She calmly placed her palm on his face, and immediately she activated the technique. Damien's face began to burn, and he screamed in terrible pain. Maria didn't even flinch as she watched the fire devour his flesh. When it was over, she cut off his head with one sharp blow. The vampire's face contorted with horror as he flew, as if begging for mercy. Maria turned around abruptly. Behind her back, Damien's body fell slowly to its knees. But even decapitated, the vampire tried to use the remnants of his strength to survive. Hearing a strange sound behind her, Maria immediately turned around. Behind her, a massive fire erupted. The flames were rising into the sky. Maria quickly bounced back and stared in surprise at the flames. Where had it come from? In front of her stood a completely transformed vampire. He said it was the power of the Ark. Maria was furious. She had cut off his head. Why was he still alive? The vampire suddenly slapped her face with his huge hand, but Maria managed to cover herself with her sword. He grabbed her sword and squeezed it with such force that the blade began to crack. Maria immediately activated the blood rays, hoping to repeat the previous attack. But the vampire covered himself with his arm, waited out the attack, and even healed his wounds. The girl was shocked. This monster didn't turn to ash like the others. The vampire grinned, noticing her confusion. Concentrating the power in his hand, he waved sharply in her direction. Maria barely dodged it. Suddenly, Maria heard a familiar voice. It was Hibiki. He called out to her. She turned around sharply, glancing at him anxiously. He shouldn't have seen her in that form. The vampire smirked. "Since you're distracted, it means you're overconfident." In the same instant, he pierced her ribcage with his massive hand. Hibiki snapped out of his seat and ran towards her, but blood was already pouring out of Maria like a river. Maria screamed in pain. The sound carried across the battlefield. Hibiki froze, watching the sword pass through his partner's body. He shouted and rushed to her, holding out a trembling hand. The vampire stared at Hibiki in surprise, figuring it was another vampire who had come to Maria's rescue. Grinning, he said, "She was unique, and you look pathetic. Alone? That's stupid even for you." Hibiki picked up Maria and stared angrily at his enemy. He looked at the pile of bodies around him and realized Maria had single-handedly wiped out all those vampires. Damien said, "Everyone loses someone on the battlefield. It's normal." Suddenly, Hibiki heard Vlad's voice. He called the vampires thieves using his power. Hibiki froze. Was that Vlad's power? A lot of things became clear now. The Ark is a vessel that contains some of Vlad's power. After his death, the vampires tried to steal this power, but they didn't make it. Vlad added, "Now that power lives in others like an Ark, but it's not for them." Hibiki rose abruptly and grabbed his sword. "If we don't stop them, they'll reinforce Vlad." Vlad replied excitedly, "I'll give you everything, Hibiki, anything to win." At this time, the vampire created a wave of fire, and it was rapidly approaching Hibiki. Seeing the approaching fire, Hibiki flinched sharply. He bounced back, crouched down, and swung his sword with force, driving the flames away. The vampire stepped closer and suddenly asked, "You're not human?" He lightly touched Hibiki's sword and immediately created a palm of fire. The blade cracked and shattered into splinters from the heat. Hibiki asked Vlad in surprise, "Isn't the Ark supposed to give more power?" Vlad shook his head. "There's another way to strengthen," he added. "I'll borrow some of your blood," and began to collect the blood in the palm of his hand. From it, he began to form a scarlet ball filled with power. At this time, the ranking system went crazy. The screens flashed the same result. Impossible. Too high a rank. Hibiki noticed that it was as if the system had gone crazy. The numbers were jumping around as if it had just broken down. The vampire asked, perplexed, "Who are you?" "A mere human cannot use the Ark." In response, Hibiki calmly raised his hand and effortlessly consumed all the flames in front of him. The vampire recoiled at what he saw. He was clearly frightened. Hibiki grinned. "Since this flame was created from Vlad's blood, it's mine now." Immediately, he directed a huge stream of fire directly at the enemy. The vampire didn't even have time to defend himself. He only gritted his teeth, taking the blow. He screamed in pain, but then wheezed, "It's no problem. I'll heal a wound like that in no time." Hibiki didn't bother to argue. He simply created dozens of bloody swords and threw them at the enemy. Damien screamed, bleeding. "Who are you anyway? Why do you have such power?" Vlad snapped his fingers and held back a smirk as he said, "I am the king of vampires." At that moment, all the swords pierced through Damien's body, leaving him no chance, not even for the afterlife. A crazy smile spread across Vlad's face. "So you remembered me?" he asked, satisfied with revenge on one of the traitors. Damien cried out in pain, feeling the bitterness of defeat. But unable to stand, he fell to the floor, leaving blood where he lay. Still conscious, Damien weakly muttered, "You have incredible strength, but I believe that with the power of the Ark, even such a wound can be healed." He grabbed the Ark and tried to use its power to heal, but this decision turned out to be a terrible mistake. When he touched the Ark, bright flames erupted around him. He began to burn alive, not understanding why the Ark did not save him as usual. The flames grew brighter and stronger, engulfing his body. Soon it reached a terrifying size. Hibiki, calmly watching the vampire burn, said in a cold voice, "The Ark is a vessel for power." "This is only a fraction of the king's power," Hibiki continued, "but no vampire could withstand such might. The body that cannot withstand this force will be swallowed up by the Ark." Hibiki stood silently and watched the vampire turn to ash. When he got bored, he turned around and walked forward. Hibiki headed towards the Ark, knowing that thanks to it, Vlad would be able to recover his strength at least a little. But as soon as he bent down to pick up the Ark, hundreds of bats appeared around and took it away. The bats brought the Ark to their master. The latter, examining it thoughtfully, said, "It seems that this task was too difficult for Damien." The brunette scrutinized the Ark, saying judgmentally, "I'm even ashamed of him." Seeing the vampire, Hibiki called out to him, shielding his hand from the pesky bats. The vampire cast an attentive glance at Hibiki, thinking his face was familiar to him somewhere. Hibiki stood at a loss, looking at the vampire floating in the air, surrounded by many bats. Lawrence, unfazed, said, "I don't have time to talk to the likes of you, but you know I'll kill you the next time I see you." Hibiki shouted and tried to ask Lawrence to wait, but suddenly he heard a voice behind him and turned around quickly. He saw Mary lying on the ground with people gathered around her, rushing to help. After a few minutes, they carefully bandaged her wounds. Hibiki learned that although Maria was bleeding heavily, her wounds were not fatal. She should rest, and with the passage of time, her wounds would heal. Squad members thanked the healer for his help. The healer reported that in addition to external injuries, Maria suffers from severe exhaustion. She has lost a lot of vitality, and this may affect her life expectancy. Hearing this, Hibiki became even more concerned. He was especially worried about how this might affect her life in the future. Captain Jinguji turned to Hibiki with a question. "Can you tell me what happened?" Hibiki revealed that Maria had faced a vampire, at the level of a marquis. No one expected her to fight so hard against such a strong opponent. The vampire she was fighting had only been transformed yesterday. His appearance had changed as soon as Maria had actually destroyed him. When Hibiki told this, he was asked to repeat it. He showed the Ark and explained, "This vampire used the Ark by parasitizing on its power, absorbing it into his body." Jinguji nodded and confirmed, "Looks like it was indeed a vampire artifact." The commander then asked, "Maria only defended the Red neighborhood, right?" He added that even when Maria was a hunter in his unit, she often acted alone. There were always towns full of corpses left behind after her campaigns. She had incredible strength. Hibiki hesitated for a moment. He wanted to protect others, and he understood that Maria was striving to do the same. But something about her motivation seemed a little different to him. He felt as if Maria was specifically looking for vampires, which begs the question, is her condition related to this? Maybe her becoming a vampire had something to do with this moment? While Hibiki was deep in thought, he didn't notice a hand being placed on his shoulder. The blonde guy with the eye patch smiled and politely offered to talk to Hibiki. Hibiki flinched a little, but still agreed. A few minutes later, the two of them were already sitting together, ready to talk. Hojo placed a cup of hot tea in front of Hibiki and asked if he liked the tea. Hibiki decided to finally introduce himself, because he had never said his name before. The blonde man's name was Hojo, and he was the captain of the 6th team. Hojo apologized for suddenly offering to talk, but explained that he just wanted to have a little chat. He shared that Maria started out on his team. She helped to improve the atmosphere in the group with her skills. He didn't know why she left, but he was sure she was still trying to protect everyone. Hibiki, hearing those words, said that Maria had also protected him. But Hojo immediately corrected him, adding that he didn't mean it that way, and offered to drink something warm to cheer him up a bit. Sato, who was watching what was happening, thought to himself, "That's why they were so easy on the vampires." Sato clenched his fist tightly, thinking to himself that these two did look suspicious, especially after their successive attacks. He quietly squeezed his wrist with his other hand and whispered that he needed to eliminate these two. Meanwhile, Hibiki and Hojo continued talking, and soon learned that they were both from the same town. When Hojo heard this, he couldn't contain his joy, and immediately started talking about the local seafood. Hibiki said that his family often made tomato soup with seafood, and Hojo, upon hearing this, suggested that the idea could be passed on to their chef. Hibiki felt calmer in Hojo's company. He had originally thought he was a scary person, but he was bright and cheerful and energizing to be around. Suddenly, Hojo said that he had the same name as Hibiki. He didn't immediately realize what he was talking about. Hojo explained that the name he is now called by was given by Captain Jinguji, along with the title of captain. Hojo then talked about his rough past, how he lost his parents and friends to vampires. Grinning, Hojo added that his words might sound arrogant, but he really understood Hibiki's feelings and wanted to support him. He said that in order to protect others and end the power of vampires, they must fight. He also added that Hibiki must become stronger. Hibiki replied sharply and without question that he would get stronger. After this meeting, he went to his room and started a conversation with Vlad. He said that he really enjoyed talking to Hojo, and that he would like to talk to him more often. Vlad reminded him that right now, he needed to focus on gathering as many arcs as possible to fully unleash his powers. Hibiki, wasting no time, reminded that he was already well aware of the importance of that. Vlad revealed that Lawrence, who took the arc, is a political extremist among the vampires. He wants to exterminate humans completely and acts independently of others. Vlad also added that Lawrence uses the arcs even knowing that his allies will not stand for it. Hibiki asked how it was even possible for a vampire to jeopardize the lives of his allies so easily. Vlad explained that vampires and humans were different creatures, and they perceived the world differently. When Hibiki inquired about the arcs, Vlad said that if he regained his strength with them, he wouldn't need to drink Maria's blood anymore. Hibiki smiled happily, saying that he could get stronger without it. Vlad replied that if he didn't take the life force from the blood, it would be equivalent to protecting Maria. Besides, drinking blood every time was quite a hassle. Hibiki was stunned as he hadn't even thought of this before. He jumped up abruptly and shouted that they needed to discuss the contract again. Vlad immediately said no, saying they would talk later. But suddenly a sharp blade aimed at Hibiki, interrupting their conversation. At first, Hibiki thought they were being attacked by vampires again, but to his great surprise, an armed Sato was standing in front of him. Hibiki explained to Sato that he wasn't a vampire, but he didn't even listen. He attacked at once, and only quick reaction saved Hibiki from sword attack. Sato instantly shortened the distance and brought his sword right over Hibiki's leg. Hibiki tried to stop him with words, but he moved his blade sharply and made a cut on his leg. Without waiting for an answer, Sato grabbed Hibiki by the collar of her clothes. Looked tough and said he didn't care who he was. He just wanted to get rid of a threat on the team. He brought his knee up and punched Hibiki in the stomach with all his might. The guy fell down, coughing up blood, and Sato walked over and said that if he couldn't even fight back, just let him die. Vlad's voice rang in Hibiki's head. He was offering to use his power, or else the guy would just die. But Hibiki hesitated. He didn't want to use force against a human. Vlad tried to convince him, saying that Sato had a clear advantage and couldn't survive without Hibiki's help, and asked if death was better than salvation. Pointing at him, Vlad called Hibiki a weakling. Hibiki still drew his sword and stood up and tried to speak to Sato, asking him to stop. Shouted that hunters shouldn't fight amongst themselves. They should be united. But Sato wasn't listening. He grabbed Hibiki's face and clamped his hand over her mouth and nose. Hibiki was beginning to choke. His strength was becoming less and less. Sato pointed his sword at him and told him to say hello to his friends in the afterlife. Vlad couldn't let die and tried to seize control of his body. Sato froze, noticing how Hibiki suddenly changed right before his eyes. Vlad, taking control, grabbed his sword and managed to put up a block, saving himself from the blow. Sato pointed his blade right at Hibiki's eye and angrily asked who he really was. People walking by stopped in horror when they saw Sato threatening the guy with a gun. Hojo yelled loudly, demanding an explanation from Sato, what he was even doing. Not wanting unnecessary witnesses, Sato retreated, and Hojo quickly oriented himself and told him to call medics for Hibiki. Sato wanted to leave, but Hojo tried to stop him and asked him to explain himself. But Sato ignored it and went outside, glumly rambling down the path. He had no doubt. There was definitely something of the vampire in Hibiki. He remembered how he'd counterstrike, not with his blade but with the back of his sword. Clearly he didn't want to kill, but why spare his enemy? It didn't matter now, though. Looking up at the moon, Sato quietly promised himself. One day he would kill Hibiki. After a while, Hojo apologized to Hibiki, sincerely admitting that everything happened because of his oversight. Hojo apologized again, and promised that he would have a serious talk with Sato about his behavior towards Hibiki. Hibiki awkwardly said it was fine, but was surprised to hear from Hojo that Sato was his brother-in-law. After all, he was engaged to his sister, so there would be plenty of time to raise him. Hojo said the story was long, so he asked Hibiki to eat some good food and just listen to him. Cutting off a piece of juicy steak, Hibiki thought about it. It had been so long since he'd eaten meat, since he'd been eating only nut soups lately due to the constant attacks. Suddenly, Hojo revealed that his sister had been killed by a vampire hiding under the guise of a normal human, which is why Sato now spares no one who seems suspicious. For Sato, destroying such creatures had become something of a personal way to redeem himself. Hearing this, Hibiki felt guilty, lowered his head, and apologized for reminding Hojo of the heavy memories. He also learned that Sato had already managed to take down several vampires since that day. Hojo, remembering his sister, said quietly that Tsubaki was truly kind and strong. Everyone respected and loved her. Keeping the conversation going, the guys who suddenly appeared from behind the couch smiled and said that Tsubaki was always cheerful and could heal not only wounds, but also souls. The girl joked that Tsubaki often brought things that the absent-minded Captain Hojo forgot, and he retorted by asking her not to tell others about it. Not a good fact about an older brother. The girls then politely greeted Hibiki and said they were from Hojo's squad. The dark-haired one was named Mifu, and the one with ponytails was named Ku. Hibiki introduced himself in response, but the girls had already grabbed his hands, happily stating how pleased they were to meet him. Ku suddenly asked if it was true that Hibiki had fought alongside Maria. Hibiki shuddered and froze confused. He had no idea where they were getting such details. Ku said that she really hoped that such a legendary Maria really existed, and Hibiki was taken aback by the pressure, and for a second didn't even know what to answer. The girls peppered him with questions. Is she really strong? Is she still alive? How old is she? Hibiki awkwardly asked back, wasn't Captain Maria the founder of the Hunters? That's when he learned that the events in question were more than a century old, even before the girls became hunters. Hibiki was shocked when he realized that his partner, Maria, was the legend that had been talked about for 100 years. And at that moment, Maria slowly opens her eyes and regains consciousness. Hibiki froze in place. Captain Maria, she's been listed as a hunter for over a decade now? He couldn't even imagine not knowing anything all this time. Vlad suddenly appeared behind him with a sly grin. I always suspected something about her. She never seemed like an ordinary person, he said. A crowd had gathered around Hibiki. The guys were talking, discussing what they had heard, until someone behind them suggested asking questions directly. It was Maria. She came closer and smiled softly at everyone present. Hojo, sitting next to her, greeted her with relief. It's good to see you well, he said. Maria bowed her head respectfully. It had been a long time since their last meeting. When they heard the girl's name, the people around them began to whisper. All eyes in the hall were fixed on her. Hibiki looked at Maria excitedly. He was worried if she could get up already, but she calmly replied that she was fine. The medics found wounds, but they were not life-threatening. Despite her words, Hibiki still continued to worry. And behind them, the boys began to whisper cheerfully. They say Maria is not human. The real Maria is superhuman, no other way. Hibiki's mind flashed back to recent events. He remembered how Maria had been punched through the chest. It wasn't just a scratch. He still didn't understand how she had even survived. He was pulled out of his musings by Maria's calm voice. But what surprised him even more were her words about talking in private. Hibiki wasn't the only one who froze. Even the guys around him fell silent for a second. Maria just looked at him with a slight smile. They certainly had a lot to talk about. And he wasn't the only one. Hibiki didn't understand what was on her mind. Everything seemed even more confusing. But Maria abruptly changed the subject and calmly turned to Hojo. She reminded him that the other captains had already gone to the conference room. Hojo jumped up as if he'd been electrocuted. He had completely forgotten about the meeting. He said goodbye to everyone and hurried away, promising to return. Flying into the conference room where everyone had already gathered, Hojo awkwardly apologized for being late. In the room were the 5 squad captains and Hodo, the one who was temporarily acting. When Hojo saw him, he didn't even realize what was going on. The man grinned. Taking your time, as always. Hojo hadn't expected to see him here and was clearly surprised. Suddenly, Hojo heard someone calling his name. It was Otori, the commander of the 2nd squad of hunters. He came over with a serious look and said he was surprised to see Captain Jinguji absent. Hojo just waved his hands. He answered honestly that he didn't know anything. According to him, the captain of the 7th squad had simply instructed him to go to the meeting in his place, and then disappeared. Otori sighed heavily, but quickly pulled himself together. He looked at everyone present and said that they had received a new directive from headquarters. Now that all the data from the search parties has been collected and confirmed, It's time to move on to the next stage. A surprise attack on the vampire's territory. He specified that the target would be Ducal Branch Castle, where the Advent group said high activity had been spotted. This castle serves as a staging point for the main production of Yams. We have no right to lose a second. Everything must go exactly according to plan, said Otori, adding that Dungi, along with Hodo, would lead the front line. He also said that S-Class hunters and resistance members have already been sent there. They are acting as a vanguard. At this time, far from the headquarters, Jinguji was watching the battlefield from a high cliff. Below, blood, bodies, and the rumble of battle raged below. He squinted his eyes and thought with a weary expression, how many people must die for one successful start? At that moment, the howling of sirens could be heard from different directions. The sound spread rapidly through the neighborhood, filling the air with anxiety. The offensive had begun. The guys looked at each other. The mood changed dramatically. Maria calmly said out loud what everyone had already guessed. It's starting. All the squad captains advanced at the same time. Hojo took command. His 6th squad and Jinguji's team were now one assault squad. He gave the order to be ready within 5 minutes. The soldiers immediately moved. There was a commotion. The 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th squads were to move out next, as a reserve. Todo turned to Maria and Hibiki. He said they would fight as temporary members of Jinguji's squad. Maria agreed for the two of them at once. Hibiki only nodded, still not fully understanding how this had happened. Jinguji's team came over to cheer the guy up. One of the fighters smiled. Relax. No one expects you to be a hero right away. Another added with a smile. The main thing is not to die. Blood flashed scarlet in the night darkness. Hibiki silently struck one blow after another. Turning around, Hibiki glanced at the pile of bodies. The ground was strewn with bodies on both sides. Even the S-Class hunters had suffered casualties. The fight had already lasted so long that time had lost its meaning. Hibiki fought off another attack. There was one question swirling in his mind. How long would he last without human blood? Scarlet liquid splashed into his face. He turned his head sharply. Maria. She'd been shot in the side. Are you okay? He shouted out, not hiding his alarm. Captain Maria replied calmly, as if she wasn't the one bleeding. Why should I be out of order? Hibiki looked at her incredulously. It was as if she didn't feel any pain at all. Even injured, she remained just as confident. Hibiki didn't know whether to worry or admire. At that moment, Todo threw a powerful punch. Wiping off his sweat, he looked around and noticed Jinguji again. It was as if he had materialized in the middle of the front line. Lawrence was lying on the couch, lazily watching the night sky. There was a noise coming from the street. The vampire figured the guards could handle it. He didn't care much. Suddenly something outside the window caught his eye. He squinted his eyes. Rising up, Lawrence saw what he was looking for. Behind the glass stood the hunter. On the roof opposite the castle stood Jinguji. He looked down at the battlefield in silence, and then looked away, hearing the sounds that came from there. Without hesitation, Lawrence jumped out the window. He headed straight for the hunter. How did you get in here? The vampire was angry. It was unclear why he'd come. Is he watching? Come just to watch his allies die? Jinguji stared coldly without a single emotion. Lawrence couldn't figure out who he really was.